Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 10th edition of the Montreal Comic Arts Festival. My name is Ian McGillis. I write about books and visual arts for the Montreal Gazette, and it's my pleasure today to be talking to Charles Soule, who's an author with really a remarkably long and diverse list of credits. So many things we could talk about, but we're going to focus on Undiscovered Country, which is a book that now has 2 volumes. It's an ongoing series. The second volume, I think, was just published last month or about maybe 2 months ago, Charles?
Yeah, that's right.
Since that one is still quite new, and to avoid spoilers partly, we're going to focus more on the first one, which is subtitled Destiny. Before we get into specifics about that, Charles, I thought maybe just a bit of backstory about your history with comics and what first drew you to them, and whether at what point maybe a hobby became something more for you.
Sure. I mean, I think almost everyone who writes comics in any real way, I've loved comics since I was very little. Like, comics are the perfect medium for hooking a young reader because they have incredible, they have pictures and they have words and they have incredible stories and bright, technicolor superheroes doing all kinds of exciting things. Yeah, there you go. They're custom made almost to explode in a young reader's mind and get them hooked forever. And that certainly happened with me when I was young. I was reading Marvel comics mostly. So I remember my first big thing that I was interested in back then was a series called Secret Wars, which was it was actually Secret Wars 2, which was known as the very inferior sequel to Secret Wars 1. And then from there, I was reading like G.I. Joe comics and Transformer comics and just kind of whatever I could get my hands on. So as many people do, I sort of went in and out of comics fandom as I grew up, and had moments where I wasn't really reading much, and then I would get pulled back in when somebody would show me a really cool comic. And the thing that really sort of socked all that in was when I was in college and somebody showed me a bunch of Frank Miller work and Alan Moore's work and Neil Gaiman's work. And those 3 creators ended up being the kind of the delivery mechanism for whatever mental virus had me love comics for the rest of my life. So I've loved comics since I was little. And in terms of writing them, I primarily started writing comics because I went to law school. And I realized when I graduated from law school, like the day that I took the bar exam, that this was not really a path that I wanted to go on. And I probably should have figured that out before I spent all the money on getting the degree and student loans and all the rest of it, but it was sort of too late. So I ended up practicing law for quite a while, actually for over 15 years. But then during that time, I was pursuing a creative career at the same time. And I wrote a couple of novels, sort of was figuring out the best way to be a kind of a creative person alongside the law career that I was building. And writing seemed like the path to do it. And comics eventually seemed like they'd kind of been staring me in the face the whole time. Like I loved reading them, and I loved the idea of collaborating with other creators, which would be the artists, of course. And I liked that comics in many ways are sort of a meritocracy in a way that some other creative fields kind of aren't. Like, if you are just good at writing comics or drawing comics, you can kind of get a career in comics. Whereas novels or films or TV, there are many other kinds of gates that you have to get through before you can even have a hope of having a career in those fields. Comics is more like egalitarian in some ways. And more importantly, it was something that I could kind of pursue on the side while I was keeping the lights on with the law career. By the time I started getting into comics seriously, I had my own practice. I had opened my own immigration law practice. So I was helping people become citizens and residents of the United States, which was very fulfilling. But at the same time, I was going to comic conventions and pitching my ideas and trying to make the right connections. So eventually, after about 5 years of seriously trying, I had my first book published by SLG Publishing. They put out a book of mine called Strongman, which was drawn by Alan Gladfelter. And then from there, I just used that platform to keep getting bigger and better gigs. I did some work with Image, had some other books out. Eventually, DC called me and asked me to pitch on their title Swamp Thing, which was a huge moment for me because Swamp Thing was, one of those books that I read when I got hooked on comics forever was Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run. So, I got started writing for DC, got a few books there. And then, as I say a lot, the easiest way to get a job writing for Marvel Comics is by having a job writing for DC Comics, because they want to know who's this new talent that's over at the other guys. So, and I had, as part of my earlier networking, I had been in touch with Marvel. I knew people there, and they reached out and asked me to work on a book called Thunderbolts for them. So that was my first Marvel work, which I followed up with a book called She-Hulk, which was very well received, fortunately. And then that got me my first, what I would consider A-list gig, which was a book called Death of Wolverine, with Steve Niven, who is he's Canadian, he's up in Halifax. And he and I have worked together many times over the years, and is one of my favorite people and collaborators in comics. So, when Death of Wolverine landed, it was really just, that was 2014. And I've been a steady writer for Marvel ever since. I'm doing a lot of work for them now on their Star Wars stuff. I do a lot of work with Star Wars in general. And in the meantime, I've done independent comics with Image and other places, and I've written novels under my own name, and I've just kept myself really, really busy. Screenplays, music, all kinds of things, which I guess sort of brings us up to date and takes us to Undiscovered Country, which is one of my most recent Image.
Yeah, given that our time is limited, we better get to it. I do have a question about how your law practice may have informed the book. We'll get to that a little bit later. You have a sort of afterword in the book talking about some of the origins of this project, and the CIA comes up.
Yes.
So that's not something you see in every book. So
no. So the first thing to say is that I co-write this book with a very, very good friend of mine named Scott Snyder. Scott is also a very well-known comic writer. He had a legendary run on Batman, and he's done a lot of other amazing stories as well, for DC and under his own name and so on. And of course, the third member of our crew on Undiscovered Country is the artist Giuseppe Camicoli, who we just call Camo. I had worked with him before on a Darth Vader run that I did for Marvel. Matt Wilson is the colorist. Christopher Crank is the letterer. Leonardo Grassi is the current finisher and inker. For Volume 1, it was Daniele Orlandini, and then the editor is Will Dennis. You have to get through all the credits if you're going to talk about it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
it is a visually stunning book. If I didn't mention that off the top, let me say it right now. It's such a treat for the eyes. It
is. Camo and Matt and Leo and Daniele are all absolute top of their game players in comics. Like Scott and I really wanted to assemble a team that was going to be worthy of this premise, which I'm about to describe in a minute. So if people want to know what the hell the book that we're so excited about is about, I'll tell you. But, for the moment, like when we were getting, we knew that this was going to have a million different things that we needed to explain and to, it was a fantasy book. It was a science fiction book. It had historical elements. It had landscapes. It had a big cast of characters, any one of which would be challenging for an art team. And so we knew that we were going to have to get, again, the best of the best. And so we did. We hired the best of the best, and we're so happy to have the team we have. So as far as what this book is, what the story is, Undiscovered Country is about America. It is about a very simple concept, which is that a few years from now, America announces that it will be closing its borders completely. There will be no travel. There will be no trade. There will be no internet. There will be no communication of any kind. America is going to become a completely sealed off black box from the rest of the world. And you could think of it like North Korea, but much more extreme. Like there's no diplomacy. There's just America just disappears from the world. And they do this in a variety of different ways. They put up walls. They have like satellites. They have force fields, all kinds of stuff. Sort of science fiction, sort of real. And then many years pass. 30 years pass with no communication from the United States at all. The outer world changes in many ways, with the power vacuum of the United States being gone. And then basically an invitation goes out saying, we have something you want here in the States. If you send an expedition, maybe we'll let you have it. And so a group of 7 people from the outer world comes into the United States for the first time in 30 years to see what's happened. And they go on an expedition traveling through the country, and they see that whatever they expected to see inside the United States, it is much, much weirder and much crazier than that. So it draws on a lot of influences that Scott and I have, and Camo, everything from Jurassic Park to Mad Max to, Spielberg movies to, I don't know, obviously American culture and history. So it's a very exciting, all over the place kind of book. It's really fun. But you brought this up when you asked about the CIA elements. And so I wanted to talk about that story briefly. So the funny thing about the Undiscovered Country concept, the idea of the United States sealing itself off from the world, is that it's real. It's a real idea that the United States has. I mean, even putting the pandemic aside, right? Like that was like a travel ban. It's not the same as actually putting up walls and so on. But the United States has a plan in place of how it would actually seal itself off from the world. It's called Fortress America, and it war games out things like what we would do with the military, how we would handle raw materials that don't exist within the borders of the United States, oil, all kinds of things like that, food production, energy. And we learned about this because someone who actually lives quite near Scott in his hometown is a retired, and I say retired in quotes because we don't think he's actually retired, CIA operative, a CIA affiliated person, let's put it that way. And so he knows a lot of things about American governmental policy and plans and technology, things that are not really public it's not like they're top secret. He wouldn't tell us if they were top secret, but they're definitely things that people don't talk or think about. And in part of talking to him, we already had this idea, and we went to him and we're like, so this is what we're thinking. And, does this spark any ideas for you? Is there anything that you think would be interesting about this? And he's like, well, we kind of know how we would do it if we ever had to do it, which was a fascinating thing to hear from him. So through him, we were actually able to visit the CIA. We're actually able to visit another important location called DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is kind of America's science fiction think tank, where they think of technologies for 100 years from now and how we would actually build them. Fascinating group of people. So we got to talk to them about what things that America was working on and how we would incorporate those into this story and other stories. It's been really fascinating. And one of the things we talked about with those people was mRNA vaccines and how excited they were about how quickly they could manufacture vaccines using this new technology. And, that was probably 3 or 4 years ago. And then to hear that Pfizer and Moderna used that technology to make the coronavirus vaccine is fascinating. And the implication from when we met with DARPA was that it was still quite a, good little ways away, but apparently they've accelerated everything because we got hit with a pandemic that we needed to fix. So anyway, I just talked for a long time about a lot of different things, but
you probably touched on this already, but I certainly found myself as a reader, whether consciously or unconsciously, looking for a contemporary political dimension to this story. And there's certainly, things, coincidental or not, that are almost eerily in sync with what we've seen in the last couple of years and even earlier with the previous administration.
Yes. Well, I mean, we set out to make a book that is primarily, it's about America, but we also really wanted it to be entertaining and not a polemic or something that's preachy or, it's not, that's not really what it is. We also didn't want it to be particularly, liberal or conservative in terms of its political leanings. We wanted it to be sort of apolitical, which is very hard to do in these times because everywhere in the world is very politicized, whether it's, England or Brazil or India or America or Canada. Like every place seems to have deep divides that I don't know that were necessarily as prominent when I was growing up. But the world seems pretty divided right now. It's something that's probably sort of cyclical. But Scott and I wanted to write a book that talked about that divide and talked about America in particular as a place that had lost its way in part because it had stopped seeing America as one thing. America is sort of two things right now, at least. And so we wanted to reflect that in the book. Again, not in a preachy way, but
no, I didn't mean to imply that you were being preachy or heavy-handed. It's just something that I found myself thinking of as a. Yeah.
Look, you know, in the story, the United States builds walls to keep foreigners out. Like it's,
Yeah.
you know, it is a story that brings in elements from the real world, even though they're heavily stylized and exaggerated and brought to sort of a science fiction extreme. But you know, another big element of this story that we haven't even really touched on in this conversation is that the reason that the expedition goes into the US is that there's a huge global pandemic happening that is killing off the world's population. And the United States says that they have a cure. And so the reason that the expedition goes in is to try to negotiate for that cure. So we started writing Undiscovered Country in, I don't know, I want to say 2017 probably. So the pandemic wasn't even, you know, it wasn't even a glint in our eyes, so to speak. And then to have this book coming out that is reflecting so many things that are happening in the world, from, you know, divisions and protests to the pandemic, to isolation, to all this stuff. It's been very strange. And we have tried to resist the urge to directly touch on or discuss current events in the book. Every once in a while in the back matter, we will, in our essays that we include. But we don't want it to be a book about like these specific moments, but we do kind of want it to be a book about this time. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah. I mean, in the opening pages, for example, we see people wearing masks to protect themselves from something called the sky virus.
Yeah, exactly.
Was that conceived before all of what's happened?
It was. I swear, like all of it was. We came up with all of it years ago. You know, I mean, the documents, we started talking about this book, you know, I think if anything, I would say that Scott and I started talking about this book in the first couple of years of the Trump administration, because it was, you know, the divisions in America were so obvious and so clear. Like we were not one country, and it was, you know, you saw some of that with Obama, you saw some of that with Bush, you know, like, but with Trump, I think it was brought to an extreme that is just very, like, we still haven't reckoned with it. You know, you look at January 6th and all the things that have happened, like we're a country that, you know, needs to work on itself a little bit. And whether that's by sealing itself off from the rest of the world and building walls and putting up force fields and having lasers and all these other things, maybe, I hope not. But, you know, I think that the way that the book reflects the real world is simply because Scott and I were just looking at the world that we have. And you know, if things have progressed along a timeline that is sort of reflected in the book, we're as surprised as you are. We did not think it was going to go quite as far as it seems like it has. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's pretty eerie. I hinted at this earlier, but are there ways in which your experience as an immigration lawyer informed this book? It's hard not to draw some connections there. Absolutely.
I mean, one of the things that I would say is particularly true is that, you know, as an immigration lawyer, I dealt with a lot of people who, you know, I dealt with, I guess it sort of depends. I mean, a lot of the people I dealt with were trying to come here because they had job offers, they had work here. And some of my clients were people who were, you know, marrying an American citizen and so wanted the American citizenship to stay. Some were people who had what are called exceptional ability or extraordinary ability, and so they had the ability to become American residents just based on the idea that America would want somebody that's highly skilled or talented like that. Mm-hmm. And so what all of those people kind of had in common was a sense of what America was. A sense of what I would call, for lack of a better term, the American dream, right? The American promise, the idea that you could come here and you can change your life. The ability to change your life in the United States is different than it is in other places. And everybody had their own version of that, whether it was through culture, whether it was through work, whether it was through love and marriage and family, whether it's through education, right? Because a lot of students were coming for American educations. But America feels like a place of promise. And whether it is, whether it isn't, whether the American dream is real, whether it's not, whether that dream is true for some and not true for others, all of those things are valid parts of the discussion. But everyone knows that story. Everyone feels it on a deep level, at least the clients I work with. And I'm not saying America's like, it's not perfect, by any means, it is not perfect. But it seemed to be a place that people had a mythological sense of. And that was powerful. That was a powerful idea for me as an attorney trying to help them realize their dreams. And it's powerful for Scott and myself when we're writing this series to deal with the power of America. And, this is a place that looms large in the imaginations of the world. And I do not think it is perfect. I'm not really an America apologist. I do love my country, and I'm glad to be an American citizen, but there's a lot of problems here. Nevertheless, for all of the problems, I think there's a lot of good too, like an extraordinary amount of good that this country can and does do. And I think if there's anything we're trying to do with Undiscovered Country, it's make people think about that part of this place, and how we might go to that place rather than to dig ourselves deeper into the problems that we have.
Mm-hmm. Well, this book is part of a genre that seems to me tends to inspire real loyalty, deep loyalty among its readership. I just wonder how generally what the response has been like to the first volume of Undiscovered Country. Have you had a lot of feedback? Have you had responses that have surprised you or that have particularly pleased you?
It's been very strong. I mean, people, you can kind of tell if you read volume 1 that it's a book that is going to go for a while. We have a plan to tell somewhere between 30 and 50 issues. I kind of like the idea of doing 50 issues because we had
a question about that actually. Oh. How many issues can we expect for Undiscovered Country? Please say a lot. So
right. Well, there you go. That's a sense of the kind of questions we tend to get. We will do at least 30. That's for sure. We have discussions about it all the time. The only reason we wouldn't go to 50 is if we feel like we've told our story in a shorter number of issues, or the audience doesn't support it, which fortunately, does not seem to be a problem, which is an amazing thing for an independent creator-owned comic. Or if Scott or I or both of us or Camo have obligations that take us away from being able to do the book the way we'd like to, because Undiscovered Country, while we all love it, is not our only project. I have many other things going on. So does Scott, so does Camo. And so we want to be able to take this all the way to the finish line. We will definitely finish the story. That is guaranteed. It's just whether it's something we do in around 30 issues or whether we take it to the full 50. So, but that's where we intend to go with it.
How far ahead do you plot in a case like this? Like, is there a literal drawing board?
There is.
Allow yourself some scope for spontaneity through the process?
Scott is a big proponent of the drawing board. I'm a little bit less so. I tend to take notes in notebooks and things like that. But he likes the big whiteboards. We have a pretty locked in plan for what we think is going to happen. The way that the book proceeds is sort of like, like The Walking Dead, the Robert Kirkman. Right. So everybody probably knows The Walking Dead who's watching this. In any case, so in that book, the group would kind of go to a new setting in each arc. So the first one was kind of like getting out of Atlanta, and then they went to the prison, and then they went to the suburban town, and they went to just different places. There was always kind of like a different setting for each arc. And so we're doing something similar with Undiscovered Country, where the first arc is set in basically the sort of the Southwest, the Old West, the Wild West of America, right. California, Nevada, Utah, things like that. And then the second arc is set up in the Pacific Northwest, which is like the tech corridor. So that's places like Seattle and Silicon Valley and so on. And we will continue proceeding through the United States in a spiral path that will go deeper and deeper and deeper until we eventually make it to the middle, somewhere around Kansas, something like that. And that will enable us to see what all the different parts of the country have become, because the United States has been divided into 13 zones, like the 13 original colonies. And each zone has a vastly different character than the other ones. So the first one is called Destiny, and it was kind of like a Wild West, Mad Max, United States Space Program mashup thing. It was very cool and fun. And then the second zone is much more of a sort of a colder science fiction-y, like THX 1138 or The Matrix, or things like that. Right. And the idea behind each of those is that they represent part of the American ideology that is taken to an extreme. So in Destiny, you have kind of manifest destiny and pursue your dreams and do whatever you want, and anarchy and anything goes. And as long as you're pursuing what you want and think you need, then may the strongest survive, which is part of American mythology for sure. And then in the Pacific Northwest, in Unity, that zone is all about American innovation and technology, and how the way that the best America is one that is putting itself forward through technology and invention and our minds. Mm-hmm. And then the next zone, which I believe we have announced, even if we haven't, the first issue of it is not out yet, is about American creativity and culture. So the people who are in that zone think that the best version of America is one that is focused on all the great things it creates. The films, the TV shows, the music, the architecture, the food. And as we move through the different zones, as we go through the spiral, we will see different sort of American principles, and the entire zone will be built upon them. So in theory, you could have one that is built around American capital, its financial stuff. You could have one built around America's, military and its fighting and things like that. And all of those will be expressed in kind of a cool, genre-y way that will be really exciting, I think, both for us as writers and for and artists and the readers.
Here's a question I ask, perhaps because I'm Canadian, but given the relationship of Canada and the U.S., how long our border is, how porous that border has been in so many ways. Can we expect, now I'm not asking you to give anything away, but might Canada seep into this narrative a bit?
I mean, Canada still exists in Undiscovered Country. It's up there.
Very prominent in the cover.
It is, exactly. At this point, what we are planning to do with Canada, there are questions, there are logistical questions about how the United States would actually pull this off, right? Because that land border is, I think, the longest in the world. If it's not, maybe it's Russia, China, but certainly the U.S.-Canada border is one of the longest in the world.
Longest undefended. That's what we were always taught in school.
Yeah, that's right. So how would the United States keep people from coming in if they wanted to leave or come across that border? And the answer to that question is they build a bunch of walls and fences, which are, and they use things like drones, which are able to do things differently than active patrolling. So, and there's also, you get into science fiction stuff. There's a concept called the air wall, which is basically an invisible force field that surrounds the entire United States. So you can't fly over it either. And so when you kind of put all the different pieces of technology together, you can posit an idea that even that border could be sealed and defended.
Okay. I noticed a couple of other questions have popped up. Let me just take a look. I guess you touched on this a minute ago, but do you already have the 13 areas all planned?
We have pretty good senses of what those 13 zones are. We have left ourselves some room to innovate and kind of make things up as we go. But I would say of the 13, we are pretty darn sure about 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of at least half of them, and probably more. They get as the path that they go through the states is a spiral, as I mentioned. So the zones by the you think of a spiral, the zones get smaller. And so the concepts sort of become more precise. Like when you're looking at the first 3 zones, unity, destiny, or destiny, unity, and possibility, they're giant, broad concepts, survival of the fittest, and then American innovation, and then American culture. Those are gigantic. But then as you go forward, you might get a little bit more precise and more focused in terms of how the zones are defined and how they work. But there's a lot of cool things that we're doing with it. I mean, it's, you know, one of the bits is that it's only been 30 years in the outer world, but it's been much longer inside the borders of the United States because they figured out a way to change the flow of time. So you can have a zone that has been being constructed for 1,000 years inside the borders of the United States, and you could have, and that could either be really good or really bad depending on what's happening with it. So I don't know. We're having a lot of fun. We're going really, really science fiction with it. There's some fantasy stuff that's going on. It's just, we can really do whatever we want, and we can play with things like American folklore and culture, American mythology. You know, like in that first volume, we have the space program held up alongside the Old West tropes as two elements of American sort of dreaming. You know, when Americans would go west to find their fortune, it's kind of not that different thematically from Americans going to the moon. And likewise, we have a lot of Las Vegas-y stuff in that first volume because people go to Las Vegas in theory to make their dreams come true, whether it's by finding some random person and getting married at the Elvis Casino or Elvis Chapel, to making $1 million at the casino, to, you know, just who knows, whatever. And so we're playing with a lot of those ideas. And you know, America is just full of them. It's a land of mental iconography in a lot of different ways. There's all these different elements of America that kind of, like I said, loom large in the world's imagination.
Mm-hmm. I also found myself wondering, maybe partly because you have some background as a musician, but how much music will get into these books? Whenever I read about other periods, whether it's past or future, one of the first things I find myself wondering is, so what music are they listening to?
We think about music a lot. If comics have any flaw, it's that music is hard to do because, you know, when you're drawing a band playing, it doesn't feel like what it feels like to hear a band, which is the only thing that's tricky. And I love music. I've been a musician since I was 3 years old. My mom had me playing violin for some reason, and I still do tons of music now, tons and tons and tons. And in this zone possibility, which is the third arc, we are looking at American culture. And so, of course, we're looking at American music. And there's a whole issue devoted to American music and what that means. And, you know, all the different phases of American music, from jazz to hip hop to, you know, rock and roll. And, you know, arguably, is rock and roll completely American? No, there's British versions. You know, there's all kinds of places in America where, you know, you could say rock and roll has a base. But anyway, so I'm getting off track because I'm thinking about the issue. I have to write it pretty soon, and how I'm going to try and say something meaningful about all of American music in 20 some pages in a medium that doesn't have sound is going to be really fascinating, and I'm excited to do it. You know, maybe I'll record some songs to go along with that issue. Who knows?
All right, I'll be watching for that. Here's a question from a viewer I want to make sure we get to. Undiscovered Country is so open to everything. How do you decide what goes in? The broad remit there.
That's actually an excellent question, because it is one of the most challenging things. So Scott and I tend to have these long, especially at the beginning of an arc, when we're planning it, when we're building a new zone, we have these really long, rambling conversations that go for hours, where we just talk about what's going to be in the zone, how it's going to work, how it's going to be constructed. And it can be challenging because every new arc, we kind of have to create a whole new system of government and philosophy and ideology and like even things like economics and mechanics, like how do these people eat and what are they, you know, or how do they get around and so on. And so that can be really all consuming. Like you could tell a whole comic book series set in any one of these zones. And knowing that we have all of American history and culture and ideology to try to cram into this too, and also be meaningful and make cool characters that have arcs, it's a lot. So basically what we end up doing is we talk a lot and then we're like, okay, these seem like the coolest ideas. And we just do those as opposed to trying to do everything, because we can't do everything. So as long as the kind of unspoken treaty that we've made with each other is that as long as we both like all of the ideas we're actually including, we don't stress out too much about the stuff we don't have room to include.
Now, do you and Scott Snyder wear different hats, so to speak? Like, what's the division of labor, if any?
We at the beginning we tried to write all the issues together, and we realized very quickly that just wouldn't work, because we ended up both kind of like tweaking issues until like the last possible minute, and it was driving everybody nuts on the team. So we did it that way for the first 2 issues, and then we started alternating scripts. So now on a Scott issue, Scott has final cut, right? So he and I will talk, and I'll give notes, and we'll talk about things, but ultimately he makes the decisions about how things are going to go in the issue. I'm like, it's not a surprise. Like, I know what he's going to do. But if I'm like, wow, I really wish this character had red hair instead of blue hair, but he likes blue hair, then the character ends up having blue hair. Like, that's the way that we've decided to do it, because if we did it any other way, we would just get stuck. We agree about almost everything, but it only takes a couple of things to disagree about to get a book held up. Right. So in the interest of keeping things going and just getting the book out on time so that people can keep reading it, we do it that way. We alternate issues, which has worked really well, honestly.
When we were chatting a bit before we went live, you mentioned that now is a particularly busy time for you.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that entails? It seems you must have been very busy for most of the last, many years, given.
Yeah, I have. I've been kind of nonstop for, basically a decade, honestly. Like, it's because what happened was, I got my first DC book, as I mentioned, Swamp Thing. That came out in 2013. So I started working on it in 2012. And that was when my law practice was very active, and I was very busy doing that. And so it ended up being, having a really full-time, very demanding day job at the same time I was writing comics. And there was a point when I was writing, I think, 8 titles, because there was a time when I worked for DC and Marvel at the same time. So there was a point when I was writing like 8 issues per month of comics, and it just became, it was pretty brutal, and I don't know that I would necessarily recommend that. But that also gave me the security to be able to leave, to close my law practice and just be a full-time writer. Anyway, but so in terms of what I'm actually doing now, I'm obviously still doing Undiscovered Country, which is a very fulfilling book to write. Scott and I are working on the Undiscovered Country screenplay. The book was acquired by New Republic Pictures shortly before the first issue came out. So they are working on making it into a movie, and they graciously hired Scott and myself to write the screenplay. So we have the first draft of that in. We're waiting on our notes from the studio, at which point we will go back and probably rewrite the whole thing. But so that is looming in the back of my mind about when those notes will show up and what they'll be. We have, I have my 4th novel. I've written 3 so far, The Oracle Year, then Anyone, then Light of the Jedi, which was actually debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, which was very
congratulations for that. Must have been a nice day.
Oh man, it was a great day. It was a really good day. The only thing that was weird, anyway, you know what? It was a great day. Let's just leave it at that. It was really, really. So those novels, Light of the Jedi came out in January, and I am working to finish my 4th novel now, which is currently slated to come out middle of next year, I think. But that's a very, like, every day you have to work on that every day alongside everything else you're doing. I'm also currently spearheading Marvel Comics Star Wars line. I write the flagship title there, Star Wars, but also I'm running a huge crossover event there called War of the Bounty Hunters, which follows Boba Fett between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi as he tries to get Han Solo to Jabba the Hutt, while everyone in the galaxy is basically chasing him, trying to steal it from him. And that is just kicking off now. We'll run through October, and I have a lot to write for that, which has been fun. And then alongside that, I have my own some additional creator-owned series that I'm going to be doing with Image. One which has been announced is with a fabulous Irish artist named Will Slimey. It's called Hell to Pay. It's sort of a supernatural adventure about a married couple who are, like, they're very effective adventurer types. They're kind of like supernatural Indiana Joneses. And they are trying to track down 666 coins that have escaped from hell and are being used to purchase the services of demons and devils all over the world. So it's that one's a lot of fun. It's kind of like like I said, The Conjuring meets Indiana Jones. And then I have a new book that I'm working on with my Curse Words co-creator Ryan Brown, which is our follow-up to that, which should be out later this year, maybe early next, that I'm not going to spoil the premise of because it's very fun. We'll be announcing it soon. God, what else am I doing?
Well, that's a start anyway, Charles.
Yeah. I think that's most of it. I have a few other little things, but they're not worth. Yeah.
Back to Star Wars for just a minute. Given what Star Wars is in popular culture and just how just what a phenomenon it's been ever since 1977.
Yeah.
Do you feel an extra sort of pressure or responsibility maybe in joining that brand, that phenomenon?
I do. I mean, I've been a Star Wars fan since I was a really young kid. Like I remember it vividly with my, seeing Empire in the theater and then definitely Jedi in the theater. My dad would tell us bedtime stories about Star Wars stuff. And, I had the toys and I was very, very excited for the prequels and just, all of it. It was a big, big, big deal growing up. And so I don't feel about Star Wars the way I feel about many fictional universes, like I love Marvel and I love the MCU and I love watching those movies, but I'm not going to confuse that with sort of actual history or anything like that. Right. Like that's clearly a fictional thing.
Yeah.
Whereas, Star Wars, because of how I really did grow up with it, feels like, mythology, right? It has a historical quality to it that is very important to me. And so I'm not going to screw that up, I'm not going to write a story that aspires to be anything less than that same quality of historical mythology. Like I want, it's a high bar, but I want every Star Wars story I write to feel like Star Wars and Empire and Return of the Jedi felt for me when I was seeing them when I was young. And that's an impossible target to hit, but it seems like a pretty good one to aim for.
Yeah. I think we have a little bit more time, so a couple more questions here.
Okay.
What do you get from comics that you didn't from law practice? Take that.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're completely different things to me. It's like, what do you get from food that you don't get from water? They're just different. What do you get from, I don't know. They're just radically different things. I mean, the law, I don't regret being a lawyer at all. I really enjoyed helping people. I love that I settled in a part of the field that felt like I could directly change people's lives as opposed to just sort of like moving money around or dealing with lawsuits or anything like that. Like being an immigration attorney felt like I was directly changing people's lives in a positive way, which made me feel really good. But comics and creativity in general, like that's me, right? I feel like I'm expressing myself directly in a way, putting myself into the world in a way directly that the law sort of doesn't. The law, generally speaking, is about facilitating other people's dreams and desires and goals, whether that's through a lawsuit or a merger or an immigration filing or even like a divorce, right? Like those things are about helping other people achieve things that they want to achieve. Whereas creativity is about, putting my own self into the world in a way that is something I've always wanted to do. And the idea that I'm able to do it on such a large stage now, the idea that I'm talking to you during a pandemic for a comic festival in Montreal, and people are asking questions and are interested in what I have to say. Like it's amazing to me still. So law is great. I don't regret doing it. It opened a lot of doors for me and it engaged me on an intellectual and spiritual level that's important. And it taught me a lot of skills about discipline, about finishing what you start, about detail orientation, all kinds of things. But it is really not the same thing to me at all as my creative career. It's just a totally different animal.
And one last question, I guess fairly closely related. Do you ever see yourself going back to law or do you miss part of it? You find yourself pining for the courtroom? No?
Nope, I don't. I really don't. I think I occasionally will get questions about an immigration policy that's put forth by whatever government happens to be in power at the time, or somebody will ask me a question about whether or not they think that they have a case. Like a friend might ask, if I were to get married, do you think it would work, or how long would it take me to get a green card, or something like that. And I'll answer those questions, and I'll feel the old muscles kicking back in. I'll think, oh wow, it is kind of neat that I have this knowledge base, right? It's like speaking a language that you haven't spoken in a while, even if it's not necessarily a language that you use very often or even really care about that much. It's still neat to know that you have the skill set. But in terms of whether I'd want to wake up in the morning and be like, I'm an attorney and I'm going to my office and I'm going to process papers all day and do filings, you literally could not pay me enough to do that again. If I am doing that, it is because my creative career has completely collapsed. I have nothing else to fall back on, and I have to keep the lights on. But fingers crossed.
Hard to see that happening anytime soon.
Fingers crossed. Keep buying the books, and we'll see what happens.
We're supposed to finish at 4. I'm not quite sure exactly what time it is. What time have you got, Charles?
I've got 3:57.
Okay, well, that's pretty soon then.
Yeah.
What is there anything in particular you'd like to plug now besides Undiscovered Country? Something?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you guys are looking for something of mine to read, I would urge you to check out Curse Words. It's a very exciting kind of. It's funny. It's sort of a surreal wizard comedy book. It has the tone of something like Archer or Rick and Morty, except with evil wizards running around New York City. It's really fun. That's a full completed comic book series from Image. You can get all of it on Amazon or anything like that. If you actually go to my website, which is just charlessoule.com, and then there's a store there. So it's charlessoule.com/store. You can purchase an omnibus hardcover of the whole thing, which is, we could have it shipped out to you, whether you're in Canada or anyplace else. There's a lot of stuff actually. Maybe just go to my website and poke around the store and see if anything grabs you. If you're looking
going to the website, don't be confused by the 2 consecutive S's. It's Charles with an S.
Oh yeah, right. charlessoule.com. Exactly. But really, if you're looking to sort of keep up with things that I'm doing or follow me, through whatever twists and turns my writing career takes next, I'm very active on Twitter, which is again just Twitter, Charles Soule. I'm on Instagram under Charles D. Soule. And then my website, I have a monthly newsletter that I send out, which has news and updates about everything that I'm doing, as well as the ability to get early looks, buy signed stuff, whatever. Like it's for fans of my work. And I really try not to be obtrusive with it. So it really just comes into your inbox once a month, and you're easily deleted if it's not your thing.
Okay, well, we should probably wrap then, Charles. This has been a real pleasure. You certainly got me hooked on Undiscovered Country. I actually had both volumes and I intended to read them both, but couldn't read the second simply because I had read the first one twice. So
look, that's fine.
I did find it immediately rereadable book, and there's so much visual detail to feast your eyes on, and the story is so multi-layered that it seems like this could run and run.
Well, let's hope so. Well, thank you very much for talking to me, and I hope everybody enjoys the weekend and enjoys the rest of the festival. Okay.
Hopefully, we can get you up here when the festival is back in its home in the park. It's a beautiful setting when we can do it.
I would come up in a heartbeat. It would be the easiest thing in the world to get me up there. I promise. So, all right.
Well, stay tuned, everybody, for the next event, which is Dessin et Discussion avec Samuel Quentin and Olivia Carpentier. So on behalf of Charles Soule, I'm Ian McGillis, and thanks for being with us, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.